So hi, this is Basil Kilani with Tech Sparks. We are delighted to host Brant Cooper, the author of the popular lean startup book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development, which is a required course textbook at several universities, including the University of Chicago MBA program, Stanford University, DePaul, Boston University, UC Santa Barbara, and University of Oslo. Brant is passionate about growing the San Diego tech community. He runs the San Diego Tech Founders Monthly Meetup that consistently draws 200 attendees. Brant is also the curator of the San Diego edition of the Startup Digest. Brant is a mentor and a marketing domain expert at Connect. So Brant, you call your book a cheat sheet to the 4 Steps to the Epiphany by Steve Blank. Can you please comment on that?
Sure, Basil. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. So the 4 Steps to the Epiphany is sort of the modern day Bible for the lean startup movement, written by Steve Blank, I believe mid-2000s. And it was a compilation of lecture notes, so it actually wasn't a book per se, written as a book. And though it is, chock full of wisdom and the go-to book, for some people it's been difficult to get through, and that's number one. And number two, there's been a lot of additional thinking around customer development, including what Eric Ries has been up to, and others, Seton Shaw and Sean Ellis, and Dave McClure's Pirate Metrics. So Patrick and I wanted to not only provide some of the insights that Steve Blank has in the 4 Steps, but also update it, include some of the thinking of our own thinking, as well as our own experiences, as well as the some of the thoughts of the other people that are active in the lean startup movement. So our book is actually pretty easy to get through and super actionable, and so that was really our objective. And Steve Blank wrote the foreword, so we were happy to work with him on that book.
So in the book, we'd like to hear from you on what customer development is and what customer development is not. I know you have this section in your book, and it's kind of exciting how you lay out your points about what it is and what it's not.
Right. Well, so customer development is a way to engage with your customers to learn whether your idea is, valid at all, right? So you're trying to discover whether there is in fact a problem that you're trying to solve, and whether the customers feel any passion or pain deep enough around that problem that they would actually seek to use your solution. So the idea really is that you can engage your customers in a way to, one, learn, are you building a product that anybody cares about? And number two, can you reach those people? What is the effective ways of marketing and selling to those people? And that those are not just principles of execution. You can't just go to your toolkit and pull out your marketing and your sales activities and assume that that's what's going to lead your customers to your doorstep. So those things are actually learnable, and you want to learn them before you execute them. So that's really what customer development is about. Discovery is figuring out, is your product at all interesting, and then the validation part of it is you start putting these practices into work, and you're measuring to see whether people are engaged with your product or whether you've got the marketing funnel correct. And then the later 2 stages are not ones that I'm very active on, because it means that you've already nailed it and it's time to scale your company, and you're starting to input processes so you can blow up your company. So that's sort of in a nutshell what customer development is. What it's not is, and this is sort of the tricky point for a lot of entrepreneurs, it's not building what your customers ask you to build. So customer development is not about feature mongering. It's not about being a stenographer and asking your customers what would you like them to build. Because if anybody who has worked with customers knows, customers actually often don't know what they want, right? So yeah, they're going to ask for feature X, Y, and Z, but what your job is to understand is, why are they asking for those features? So the idea is to empathize, is to understand deeply what the problems and the pains are of your customers, and then it's up to your vision to build the solution. So vision is an important part of entrepreneurship. Everybody knows that. Customer development is not counter to that. It's using your vision in order to figure out what to build based on some of the things that your customer is going through, is experiencing.
So this is really interesting. Can you give us an example of a business case that went on that way?
That actually used customer development or didn't use customer development?
Well, you said you build something that does not, customers do not really know that they need. I have some examples on top of my head, but I would like to hear from you on what sort of exampms are we talking about here?
Well, sure. So in the book we use, there's a couple of different examples. There's the You Send It application, which was developed in order to send large files. Because sending large files via email is often problematic, and so the founders have this idea, this vision to build that. They go and they talk to their customers. And their customers are going, I just kind of learned FTP or something like that. So the part of the exercise is actually finding who it is that has that problem deep enough, right? So what they did is they stumbled across graphics professionals who actually weren't that technical, and so setting up like secure FTP or some of these other methods to transfer the files was actually very difficult for them. And so they working with graphics professionals were able to find sort of this early adopter community. And then part of that, again, customer development is using those people to figure out where to find them, right? Patrick, my co-author, talks about, fishing. It's like going fishing, right? You have to choose the right bait. You have to choose the right water in order to find the fish that you're actually, the specific type of fish that you're going after, right? So the You Send It guys go, well, there were forums that existed that were filled with graphics professionals, and that was an obvious place to go to cast their line. To start promoting their product. So that's a little example that we used in the book. But like you said, there's sort of numerous examples. Did you actually have one in your mind?
Well, I was thinking about Steve Jobs, creation of the whole, change of the music industry by itself. It was just something that nobody thought that they needed, but it's out there and everybody's just using it like crazy now.
Right. Well, so what's interesting is that I've got this little chart that I'll include in the next book that the more disruptive your technology is, and in Steve Blank in his book would call this like a new market. The more disruptive the technology is, the less you can believe what your customers say they will do or what they want. So, a classic question that entrepreneurs try to ask is like, will you pay for this solution? And it's very difficult to believe what your customers will say. Sometimes they'll say, "Oh yeah, I'd pay for it," and then when you put the product in front of them, they don't pay for it. And then sometimes the opposite happens, right? So the more disruptive, if you're building something that's brand new, the less able you are to take literally what the customer says. On the other end of the spectrum is what Clayton Christensen calls sustaining innovation, and that's when you're actually improving performance. You're using technology to improve performance or lower prices, but the market is really well known, and you're selling to the same customers. And so in that instance, you actually can believe much of what your customer says, and that's actually where classic product management works pretty well. As long as you're still diving in and understanding why customers are asking for specific features, you can actually believe more what they say. So the real dilemma ends up being, and the tough part for entrepreneurs is if you're doing something new, how do you engage customers in a way that you can actually get learning out of them? If what I say is true, you can't believe what they say. And so that is actually a tough nut to crack, and you have to be creative, and you have to try to get them to talk about their problems and talk about what they're passionate about, and what you're looking for there is an emotional connection to something that they're talking about, which is a signal to dive deeper. And what you're not doing in those conversations is going, "Hey, Basil, I've got this great idea, don't you think this is a really cool idea?" Because, if you're friends with the person, you're going to go, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea," or you're going to be somebody that doesn't know them and you're busy and you're going to go, yeah, it's a great idea, get out of my hair. So the key is that if you're having these conversations, don't pitch your solution first. Try to dive in and understand the life of your customer with the problems that they are currently having. So
going micro into the lean startup world, what's the importance of having a minimum viable product, MVP, and pivoting?
So the minimum viable product it's really all about having a testing culture. So instead of believing what's between your ears, that understand everything about the product and all you got to do is build it and put it out there and customers will, come running in droves. The idea is to say, no, I need to validate what's in my idea. I need to think about my business model in terms of hypotheses and then come up with experiments that I can do in order to test those hypotheses. And so while minimum viable product is sort of this, minimum number of features necessary for a customer to actually solve their problem to such a degree that they'd be willing to buy your product. That's the minimum viable product. And entrepreneurs often get caught up in the minimum side of it without the viability part. The viability part is at least as important as the minimum part. And so that idea has sort of been expanded out in our book. Patrick and I talk about what we call the intermediate MVPs, and those are sort of along a path of trying to figure out if your business model is correct or what needs to change in your business model. There are things that you can test. And so a couple of my favorite examples are in the case study in the book on Sonic Mule. So S Mule had both technical risk and market risk. And so the old school option is to build your product out far enough that you can test technical risk and you can test the market risk. And who knows, in order to get to that, maybe you have to build the whole product. And that's going to take you 6 months and it's a year and you release it. And then what if the technical part doesn't work? Or what if the market assumptions are wrong? You've just wasted your year, right? So what Sonic Mule did, which I thought was ingenious, and which hopefully inspires creativity in your audience, is they said, well, no, we're not going to build out our core product. We're actually going to release these mini products that actually test what's risky in our business model. So for the technical risk, they needed to know what the latency was of music that comes out of their iPad, and then it's going to come back in on the speakers and through to the microphones, and so they needed to measure that latency. So what they did is they built a tiny little app, just a fun little app. They released it to their customers, and the customers played with it. The product was instrumented in a way that they could actually measure the latency. And then with the market risk, what they wanted to know is, would people bump their iPhones together in order to exchange music that they had created? Well, so instead of building out their main product to that point, they built a little lighter, put it on the iPhone, and they bumped they released it to their customers. Customers would bump their phone together, and the flame from the lighter would go from one iPhone to another. And again, they instrumented that product, so they had a dashboard, and they could sit there and watch the flames, spread across the world. So not only did they validate their assumptions, but and mitigated those risks, but they actually also learned how to instrument their product so that they could test things like, what is engagement with my product and how can I improve that engagement over time. So I thought those were a couple of brilliant examples.
Are these guys doing well? I used to drive by they just have an unconventional business model. How are they doing?
Well, I actually haven't talked to them in a while, but back when I was writing the book, they were actually blowing up, and so I actually think their instruments are pretty clever and are doing well, and they had sold quite a bit. And unlike a lot of apps, they actually charge for their apps out of the gate, which I think is kind of nice because you're at least again you're testing your revenue models right from the get go rather than giving away apps and then trying to figure out how you're going to monetize that later. So Jeff Smith is the CEO, and I think he's just a brilliant CEO, and he's a classically trained musician as well. So I love the fact that he's working on something that he's passionate about.
So taking a step back, going back to customer discovery, I know you have 8 steps for customer discovery. In your opinion, what's the most important one? What's the most vital one in customer discovery?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I think it probably actually depends on the business model, and so I think it's probably up for each entrepreneur to decide. I guess I think that the way Eric Ries has encapsulated this movement so that it's really about it's about eliminating waste, right? So if you actually have a lot of time and money to burn, maybe you don't need to do this lean startup stuff, but most people don't view their life that way. So to me, the most important thing is that if you're in customer discovery or you're in customer validation even, and you can formulate a test that actually tells you on the negative side not to pursue that product. If that test fails, I won't pursue that product. Then to me, that's actually pretty powerful. And I think that it doesn't mean a small test. It means that the data that you're going to get from it is sufficient enough to tell you whether to move forward or whether to pivot onto something else. Mm-hmm. And so, I had a customer, I had a client who had been working on his product. It was a recruiting product, and he'd been working on it for a year or 2 years before I engaged with him, and he had spent probably close to $100,000. And he had a few users of his product, right? So most startups don't fail because they don't get any users. Most startups fail because they get some amount of market signal, but they can't figure out, where that beacon really is coming from and how do I get there to actually blow up my company? And they spin in this valley of death until they run out of money or they just give up. And so that's kind of where this guy was, and he's just sort of spinning there, trying to figure out where his market signal is. And so we put together a program, and we started, I sent him out doing customer discovery, customer validation, doing interviews and learning about this. And my biggest hurdle with him was trying to get him to charge for his product. And he was so afraid to charge for his product. And again, I'm not saying everybody should do this out of the gate. It was just this one example. And sort of 8 months into our engagement, after we had done a bunch of customer discovery and he built some features based on his interviews, and it came to the point I finally convinced him to charge for his product. And when he couldn't get people to pay, including lifetime customers that he would grandfather in at a lower price, and this is one group that was adamant, they loved the product, and they called him up and they said, listen, even at your lower rate, I know that this is something that you're going to want to charge for more, and I know that there's a whole path that you're going down here to monetize your business, and I just don't think it's right for us to use your product anymore because we're just not going to be that customer. And this was his most valued customer, mm-hmm. and he just realized at that point that he didn't have it. He didn't have the product. He didn't have the market, and he killed his product. And so, he was 2 years in. He's $100,000 in the hole. But it's better than have been another 2 years than another $100,000. Sure. And so sometimes the biggest wins, I tweeted this out a couple of weeks ago, sometimes the biggest wins in lean startups is actually learning that you don't have it. You don't have a real product. You don't have a real market, and you need to pivot onto something else.
Yeah, sometimes people just be in denial and they just cannot.
Entrepreneurs are passionate, right? And that's why I love working with entrepreneurs. They're passionate, but they also need to have some sort of objective measures about whether they're actually, killing it or not, whether they actually have something or not.
Sure. So, Brant, why do market segments matter in the lean startup world?
So, great question. In my mind, market segments drive everything. So, market segments are sort of understood. Market segments are not like demographics or firmographics, at least not necessarily like that. They're not verticals. So, the financial services industry is not a segment. So, it's key to understand that the definition of a market segment is it's a group of people that share the same problem and they speak the same language. So an IT manager and a CIO might have the same problem, but they don't speak the same language. Mm-hmm. The benefits that they're actually trying to get out of solving the problem are different. They have different metrics. And so your market segment you need to focus your solution on one market segment, because typically the features that are required, how you market and how you're going to sell to those segments is going to differ. And also, if you put all your resources into a market segment and you nail it, then you get to be known as a leader in that segment, and that's going to help you as you start knocking down adjacent segments. So it's sort of the bowling pin strategy, right? So you identify your number one pin, and as you knock that down, you're starting to rattle the two pins behind it. So I highly recommend people read Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm, which really laid this stuff out, I think, and is still, I think that was written in the 80s and still is completely valid today. So I'm a big fan of Alex Osterwalder's The Business Model Canvas, and I think he's got like 9 buckets in there. And I think it's a great exercise for entrepreneurs to go through and fill out those buckets. but there's a bunch of those buckets are dependent on what market segment you end up going. So I wouldn't spend too much time. I would concentrate on the problem and the solution and the market segments, and then everything. Once you've chosen your segment, once you know that you've got the right segment, a lot of the other aspects of your business model are going to come into place based upon the segment that you chose. So one customer might want a solution that's on a mobile phone. A different segment might want it SaaS on the web, and another one might want shrink-wrap software. So clearly choosing that segment is going to determine all of these other elements of your business model.
So going to the next question, and it's a really cool question. In one of your presentations, you talk about Lean Startup Mythbusters. Yeah. Again, can you pick, let's say, your favorite two?
Right. So I guess that I'm not even sure any of them are my favorites, right? I bust them because I don't like any of them. But so there's a lot of people out there that like to talk about how Lean Startups forces entrepreneurs to think small. And I think that this one is just amusing because to me it demonstrates really a certain amount of lack of insight into what's going on in our global economy. So entrepreneurship, we're seeing a renaissance in entrepreneurship, right? It's happening all over the world. I'm lucky enough that I get to go and I get to speak at different conferences and different seminars all over the world, and the ideas that I hear in Malaysia and in Chile, rival the ideas that I hear in Silicon Valley and New York City and San Diego. And so this is a phenomena that is so completely independent of one particular movement like Lean Startups, right? The entrepreneurship is global. It's happening everywhere. People are graduating from college, even from high school, assuming that they're going to start a business. Well, it just stands to reason that if you have hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs, then what you're going to see is people that are trying to solve their own problems. And guess what? A majority of those problems that people are trying to solve are not going to be the huge disruptive problems that huge disruptive companies end up, solving. They're going to tend to be a little bit small. They're going to be about their own lifestyle. They're going to, hey, I've got this iPhone. Wouldn't it be cool if the iPhone could do X? You're also going to see a bunch of people that are tackling the same problem. If you have hundreds of thousands of startups, people are going to try tackling the same problems, but they've got a small difference in the way they want to tackle it, or they're going after a different market segment. I mean, think about the startup as a product. What we're seeing is just a ton of competition for creating the right business. And to me, that can only be a good thing. And it's completely independent of Lean Startups. Now, it just so happens that Lean Startups help all of those entrepreneurs figure out what is the right product and what is the right segment for them to be going after. And so I think a lot of these observers are just conflating those two things. They see these two things rising at the same time, and it's sort of this fallacy of cause and effect, right? So I think that Lean Startups actually helps these entrepreneurs discover if there is something that's truly disruptive in their idea. So that would be sort of the number one myth that I love to shoot down. You want me to try to tackle another one?
Yeah. Fire away.
So I guess the other one is that. So I ask leaders in the startup world, what do they think about Lean Startups? And sometimes they'll say, I don't believe. I think it's great. I think Lean Startups are great, but I don't think that I would ever apply such a rigid framework or a rigid methodology into startups. And Lean Startups is nothing about a rigid framework. There really is if anybody's trying to sell you Lean Startups, here's the 3 steps you need to take in order to be a successful startup, that's just wrong, right? That's not valid. And so there is no paint by numbers approach. There is no formula. So Lean Startups is actually a loose framework that allows you to be creative. It allows the art of entrepreneurship to flourish within a set of principles that if you adopt should help you nail your product market fit quicker than if you didn't adopt those. So that would be the second myth I like to bust the most.
You have a theory on user experience, UX. What is it?
Well, so I wouldn't say that it's my theory. I think that what's interesting is that I believe UX is more important than it has been in a long time, at least in the high tech world. There's so many UX experts out there that know this stuff way better than I do. But generally, what I blogged about recently was that the technology revolution, when we brought computers and networks into businesses, the benefits that we get from that over time have changed. And originally it was really about big business productivity gains that we were seeing. And then during the 2000s, with the evolution of SaaS and the browser being, the common desktop interface for the users, what we saw were sort of departmental level productivity gains. IT didn't have to be as involved. It was lower cost. Business units themselves could now solve their own problems by buying applications that didn't require all this IT approvals and implementations. So during the 2000s, to me, it was about, departmental productivity gains. And now I think what we're at the level of is individual productivity gains. So how can we actually change users' behavior a little bit and see large productivity gains? And I think that's where UX shines. So getting these professional people to engage with customers in a way to figure out how much am I able to get away with changing their normal way of doing things, so that they can see these huge benefits to using a particular application. So I think that's why UX is big now, and I think that's why you hear a lot about UX. And so that there's people around the world that are saying, okay, well, we can't do UX the old way. I was on a panel actually in San Diego with a UX group, and somebody was talking about agile development, and this woman in the audience would raise her hand. She goes, "I can't do, you can't do UX in agile. It takes me 3 months just to schedule an interview with a customer, right?" Well, if you're a startup, you can't run your life that way. You can't run your business that way. You'll fail for sure. So how can we combine lean and the UX? Well, there's a number of thought leaders around the world now that are saying, well, listen, not one pixel more, right? So you're not going to put one pixel more into your UX than accomplishes the goal that you set out for that particular minimum viable product. And so you're following the same lean principles as engineers do when developing the minimal features. Well, the designers need to have that same sort of mentality. I'm not going to do any more design than what's necessary to solve the problem that we're trying to solve. And so what I think is really cool is that I just was talking to a couple of lean UX people back in New York, and these are bigger companies, and they're going to be in my next book, hopefully, where they're actually forming teams, engineers, designers, product managers, and I would actually even like to see marketing and salespeople included, but I don't see that yet. But they're forming teams around a problem. So they're segmenting correctly. Like I said earlier, it's around users that share the same problem. And then they've got an engineer, a UX person, and a product manager that are developing the solution, and no waste. Everything that they do is only to solve that problem. And so these are in bigger businesses, so I think it's an example of how these lean principles can be used by startups, both small and big, and again, sort of emphasizes the UX component of that.
So switching gears now to the finance world, you've given talks about investor pitches and getting a second meeting. What are some of the key points here? Well,
so I think that it's people sometimes forget what the objective of a pitch is, right? So the two things that it's almost like segmentation. I guess it's more like positioning. You have to remember, you always want to know who your audience is. And so if you're in an elevator with an investor, and the investor is actually going to let you pitch him or her, your objective isn't to get a check, right? You're not going to get a check in the elevator. Your objective is to get a meeting. And so the same sort of mentality exists no matter where you are, whatever your environment is. And so if you're in a pitch contest, right, and their investors are in the audience, and what you're hoping to do is to get an investor interested, again, you don't make the pitch as if you're going to get a check that night. What you want to do is get a meeting. And so you want to be able to tell a story. You don't want to put I believe my company is, valued at this level. Here's the stock agreement that I want. I mean, people will put terms into their pitches. And if you're an investor and you go, that's an absurd valuation, then you've not created the conversation that you wanted to create, right? You've just eliminated one of your customers without ever having the chance to negotiate or talk to them. So the key things is that if you're doing a deck, one objective per slide. So this is very difficult for entrepreneurs to do. But typically they'll try to throw in 2 or 3 things. It's my go-to-market plan, the size of my market, and what my value prop is. And it's like in 3 or 4 different sections on one slide. So each slide should answer one question. Understand who your audience is. Whether it's a room full of co-founders, if it's a room full of other startup people, is it a room full of investors? Understand who your audience is, and you have to tailor the messaging for that audience, and you should be good to go.
That was really insightful. So going to our last question, our standard question of the show, what are the key pointers you would like to give to our entrepreneurs in the Arab world?
So good question. So I don't know very much about the landscape, the startup or entrepreneurial landscape of the Arab world. I think that one of the things that I do see when I'm traveling, really outside of Silicon Valley, but especially outside of the United States, is culturally, and again, I don't know if this is true. I'd love to hear feedback whether it's true or not. It's a difficult part of an entrepreneurship culture is the acceptance of failure. So in a lot of cultures, that's really bad. You can't even admit to your parents when you failed, let alone your community. And yet failure that's the standard operating procedure for startups. And so what you want to do is use the failure to your advantage, and that's really what the pivot's all about, right? So you want to be able to you want to be able to know when it is time to change part of your business model. And so you want to hypothesize what you think is the way it should work, and then when it doesn't work that way, are there changes that I can make to try to make it work? And after I've gone through those iterations, is it time to admit failure and that part of my business model is wrong, and now I'm going to pivot? And what the term pivot really means is you're going to change fundamentally some parts of your business model while keeping what you've learned. You keep your pivot foot in what you've learned. Right. And so you have to be able to, in that way, you need to be able to grasp failure. You need to be able to understand it, and you need to not be ashamed of it, and you need to be able to use that to your advantage. And frankly, in my experience, the people who get lean startups and the people who get customer development are people that have had failures. And if you read Eric Ries's book, and if you read Steve Blank's blog and his other writings, you can find that. You can find where they've admitted their failures, and that's what pointed them in the right direction. So that's the sort of the number one message. And the number two thing is that you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be disruptive. And sometimes that means, breaking the rules, and then asking for permission later. And that's another tough thing for a lot of cultures to do. I was in Malaysia, and I was talking to this guy who said that he had this idea. There were a bunch of competitors that were doing similar things. He was a little bit lower cost, but there wasn't a lot of differentiation between his competitors. And it was this solution that he wanted to sell to farmers. And he said, but he had to get permission from the government to go and talk to these farmers or something, which I thought was like, really? But I said, I don't want to get you thrown in jail or anything, but I mean, what you should do is get in the car and go drive out there and talk to the farmers. Right. And if you actually can figure out a solution where you can make it easier for these farmers to be more efficient and to use your products, and it improves them as businessmen and that sort of thing, and you find 3 or 4 of them, and then you go talk to the government, then you've got a better case than if you're just trying to go through the bureaucracy first. And so sometimes that's what it takes. It's the risk taking, and it's the breaking the rules, and actually in the end, maybe what his differentiation is the distribution, right? So it opens up your mind to where your disruption could be. It's maybe not product features. It's maybe, Amazon, right? It's just a distribution play, right? So once you start thinking about like there aren't rules or whatever, at least in your own mind, it opens up where the creativity might come from and what it actually maybe there's a larger disruption opportunity there.
Sure. Well, in closing, thank you so much, Brant, for being in our show today. And before we actually close, I just want to show this to our audience. That's your book, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development. I highly encourage you guys to have a look at it. It's very insightful, and it should be available on Amazon, and I think Amazon also ships to the airport. So there we go. So thank you again, Brant, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in the Arab world and maybe give some training courses or something like that. And,
well, thanks very much, Vassal. I enjoyed talking to you, and I would love to come to the Arab world and meet the Arab entrepreneurs. And really, I encourage your listeners to reach out to me. My email, brant@marketbynumbers.com, and I'm very active on Twitter @Brant Cooper. And so, again, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great offer for the audience. I would really appreciate that.
Sure.
Have a great day. Thank you.
You too. Bye.